Okay, I wanted to make a video that kind of goes in detail over the GLOCK Safe Action system and why the Glock is probably the safest polymer pistol on the market. The first component of that I want to go over is the most noticeable, and a lot of people call it a trigger safety. It's a trigger drop safety is what it really is. And I want to kind of go over this component first, and then I'll do a couple other videos on each and every individual component and give them each their own time. This one here is probably the most misunderstood safety on the Glock. The reason is people see it and they think, oh, it's right there on the trigger, and it's a safety where you have to actually put your finger on the trigger in order for the gun to fire, and that's kind of what it looks like, so that's what people think, and they'll make that assumption. But the reality of it is, this is actually a drop safety. Glock knows when they made this gun that the only way the Glock pistol can fire with the other internal safeties is if you pull the trigger. This is the only way this gun can fire, is deliberately pulling the trigger. There's one way around that, though, as if the gun is actually dropped and you drop it hard enough on the rear of the gun. What happens then is the Glock pistol itself will pull its own trigger. And the way that happens is the internal components all have mass. Everything itself has mass. The slide has mass, the frame, the trigger itself has mass, the trigger bar has mass, the firing pin has mass. All these things have mass. So what happens is if you drop the gun on the back of it and it's with any deal of force, basically what you're doing is you're multiplying the weight that acts upon, or the gravity that acts upon the components inside the gun. So those parts contain mass, so the mass multiplies inside the gun, whereas something that weighs maybe an ounce all of a sudden weighs a pound when it's dropped hard enough or heavy enough. So what happens is these internal components, like the firing pin, the trigger bar, and the trigger itself, all want to move rearward. And what happens is if they do that and they're capable of moving rearward, then the trigger will actually pull itself, causing the firearm to discharge. So Glock put this trigger drop safety in here. So what happens is the drop safety on the trigger here, this little piece of polymer sliver right here, has very little mass. Polymer is light already to begin with, so it's got low mass to begin with, but then when you take and you just shave a little piece of polymer like this and put it in there, this piece of polymer has such a small amount of mass that it would take an extreme amount of velocity and force for that to move and compress itself against the spring tension that's holding it forward. So basically, they put the spring tension in there to such a degree that it would be basically impossible for you to drop this hard enough for this piece to move to the rear, and allow the trigger then to move to the rear. So what that is, it's a drop safety. That's all it is. People will say, oh, you know, it's there so you don't accidentally pull the side of the trigger or something like that. That's absolutely wrong. That may inadvertently do that. It might actually help you just inadvertently, being that's in the middle like that, but that's not at all the design. They put it here as a passive drop safety that gets disengaged whenever you put your finger on the trigger. It's an excellent part of the design. There's a few other companies that do something similar. M&P actually splits their trigger. I don't really like that as much. I mean, here you have a nice solid trigger. They're splitting it. You have two pieces. I don't think that's as good, but it still works. You have with a split trigger, you have a small piece of polymer basically that hinges on the bottom. That small piece of polymer that hinges on the M&P trigger has less mass, so it takes more mass for it to actually move against its own spring and then allow the trigger to pull back, just like this one where there's a block that has to actually be moved out of the way. So all that really is it's a drop safety. It's commonly referred to as a trigger safety, and people say that, you know, it's there so that you don't accidentally pull the trigger, but you know, that's like putting a gas pedal on top of your brake pedal. That doesn't mean anything. That doesn't do anything like that for safety. It's there for the drop safety, not so that you won't accidentally pull the trigger. Inadvertently, I can definitely see how that would help a little bit maybe if something were to kind of brush against the side of it, but the chances of that are so rare and odd. And then if you look at the M&P, that completely wouldn't help at all because it's actually part of the trigger, the whole bottom part of the trigger where you have most of the where most of the torque would be applied anyways to actually pull a trigger. So that's what that is. I wanted to go over that part because it's one of the most misunderstood parts. I've watched a lot of YouTube videos and it seems like nobody actually understands that. So that's what that is, and I'll make a couple other videos and show every individual part of this gun and why I think the Glock is the safest polymer striker fired pistol on the market.